Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this week we're going to talk about transportation. There's a couple of things when you talk about the history of business and technology in the US or anywhere for that matter. Transportation is key. Now, obviously, if there's to be business, you have to have the ability to get goods to market. Transporting goods, such as food, for example, or manufactured goods, or whatever it is, clothing, fabrics, everything, there has to be good transportation routes. So this really plays in both to business and technology. And so as we talk about business in the U.S., up to this point, I've really kind of gone out of order with this class, and it's kind of the way you have to teach this because if we just start in the early 1600s and move to the present, there's just so much to cover in every chapter. It gets really disjointed and confusing. For transportation, I'm going to sort of mesh all these eras into one quick lecture, into one quick chapter. And I apologize, I'm getting a little bit behind in my work, so I'll try to post this material earlier in the future. As far as transportation goes, really the biggies in the U.S., of course, we start out with what I'm going to call somatic transportation, and you don't have to remember that word, but somatic means of the body. So obviously, when we talk about transportation, on a trail, walking, that's one form. But as far as business is concerned, the idea of transporting goods and services via horseback or via ox and cart is really what was in place in the 1780s and prior to that time when the United States was formed. So transportation was a problem. And for any of you who've traveled throughout the United States, it's a huge landmass. So it's not like you can hook up a horse and wagon in Denver and get to New York in any good quick period of time, especially considering there were no roads at all. So we're faced with a couple of things in the early part of the country. We have no transportation technology other than horse and wagon, and there were no roads, there was no highway system. And one of the things I think is difficult when we think about history is we can't put ourselves in the place where there's no highways or no modern transportation because we take all of that for granted. So try to think back to when there was nothing. There were no trails, or at least any trails that there were muddy. If it rained, they were impassable. There was really no network. So sort of the big infrastructure things we should know about first is the National Road is kind of famous. And the National Road is famous because it's one of the first highway projects that was funded by the federal government. So think of it as an early interstate project, if you will. And it ran from Maryland, so that's on the East Coast, and eventually ran all the way to Vandalia, Illinois. But it took many years to get it that far. So much of it's still in place today, or at least if you've driven on Interstate 70, especially if you're from Ohio, you've run parallel or in the same place to where the National Road was built. And there's also a Route 40 that exists today in some places throughout the Midwest, and remnants of that are on the National Road also. There's even road signs up in some places that commemorate the National Road. So the National Road was funded by the federal government initially, and sometimes around the 1830s, when the construction of the highway was underway, the federal government stopped funding it fully and left a lot of responsibility to the states. And that's similar to the way our highways are funded today. So there's federal funding for federal roads and interstates, and then there's also state funding for state highways. A lot of that is raised via the gas tax that you pay at the pump. So that really hasn't changed that much. Along with the development of roads, and again, this is in the early 1800s, canals became a really big way to transport goods and services. So most of you have heard about the Erie Canal, I'm assuming. If you haven't, the Erie Canal, again, was built in the early 1800s. And the Erie Canal connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie. So again, if you're familiar with your geography up there in upstate New York, along Syracuse, Rochester, up to Buffalo, the Erie Canal was 328 miles. And it was a big deal because when you made that connection between the Hudson River and Lake Erie, you in essence connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. And doesn't sound like a big deal now, but at the time in the 1800s, let's say if you wanted to go from New York City to, let's just say, Cleveland, Ohio, for example, that would be a 3 or 4 week trip by horse and cart, 3 to 4 weeks. So that's a long time. And with the advent of the canal, you could get to the Great Lakes from New York in a matter of days. So it's not only about shipping people. I mean, that's important. But when we talk about the history of business and commerce, we need to understand that it brought down the cost of shipping goods. So whether it was the Rockefeller shipping kerosene early on in the 1800s from Cleveland to New York, or anything going to foreign markets from the Great Lakes and the Midwest through the canal down the Hudson to the Atlantic seaboard, it was a major deal and a major accomplishment. And that was funded both with public and private money. And if you ever want to read about the Erie Canal, it's really fascinating. You could just go on Wikipedia if you want to, because it was a very controversial project at the time, and it was thought by many that it could never be done. It was sort of a wonder of the world. So the Erie Canal was a big deal, and during that time in the early 1800s, canals were all the rage. So if any of you have traveled Ohio or Indiana, Illinois, any of the Midwest, you see canal locks or you read about canals, and that's because in the 1800s, the early 1800s, canals, they were the way that people got around, and they were the way that people moved and moved goods and services as well. As the canal system expanded in the early 1800s was the same time that the railroads were starting to take hold in the U.S. And the first railroads in the U.S., again, were the early 1800s, mostly on the East Coast. And the railroads were non-standard at the time. The track gauges were all different, so the technology was there, but it wasn't a unified, standardized technology. But it was an important technology as far as the growth of business in the U.S. And I think from a technological standpoint, certain systems like George Westinghouse's braking system and other mechanical technologies benefited the development of the railroad. Of course, the big story with the railroad is 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad started in Council Bluffs, Iowa, which is just west of the Mississippi River, and met up with the West Coast, the Union Pacific and the Standard Pacific Railroad, met with the West Coast in Promontory Point, Utah, which is near Salt Lake City. So, and it's pretty cool if you've ever gone there. You can see where the Golden Spike was put in, and where the East and West Coast railroads met. And it obviously took a lot longer to build the railroad from California to Utah, because they had to cross the mountains, and especially the Sierras. So if you've ever been out west, they're big mountains and hard to cross, and so that's why the differential, if you ever look at the maps and the progress of the railroads. The point with all of this stuff is that as far as business goes in the U.S., business grew the way it did because in order for business to grow, you have to be able to ship goods and services. And I think the other thing that's important to understand, before any cities can grow, so whether it's Chicago or Cleveland or Denver or arguably some of the East Coast cities, you can't have any kind of industrial revolution, or you can't have any kind of urban growth until you have a transportation network, because quite frankly, you have to feed people, and in order to feed people, you have to have transportation that can get food from the farm to market. And so the population growth of the country, the commerce growth of the country, the technology growth of the country, the exploitation of resources such as mining and coal mining and gold mining, all of that starts to grow with the advent of modern transportation routes. And most of this, again, is with the railroad. The other thing I talk about in the chapter a little bit, just so you're aware of it, is the St. Lawrence Seaway system. So some of you are actually in Toledo at the University of Toledo. Some of you distance learners I know are out of town, but if you're familiar with the Great Lakes, then you know that there is international shipping on the Great Lakes, and that's all because of the St. Lawrence Seaway system. So maybe you've been to the Wayland Canal in Buffalo, New York, or through the Niagara region, but again, the St. Lawrence Seaway system connects the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes via large canals and large locks, and allows for giant freighters, that travel the oceans to make it all the way west to Duluth, Minnesota. Actually, is as far west as it goes. So the St. Lawrence Seaway system's important. Again, jumping around in time, it really wasn't completed until the 1950s. So we were talking about the early 1800s earlier, but I think it's important that you understand why the Great Lakes region grew as far as business is concerned. It was all because of shipping, and most of that was from international shipping, which still occurs today, although more shipping is done out of the Gulf of Mexico and the West Coast because of the way markets have changed. But that's another story. The other important thing to think about are highways and roadways. So with the adoption of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, of course, federal highways start to grow. I'd love to get into a whole thing about the technology of building roads and pavement, but again, we're not going to have time to do that. But road building techniques became perfected, and with the advent of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, the truck, a lot of things changed in this country, as you well know. And then the next big thing would be the interstate highway system, which began in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. And the interstate highway system's interesting because, not only is it something that all of us use every day for fast transportation, but originally it was a result of World War II. And one of the lessons that the U.S. learned in World War II is that Germany had a very good highway system called the Autobahn, which is very similar to our interstate highway system. And it was Eisenhower who realized that good roads are important to the defense of the country. If there was ever a land war in the United States, our roads were certainly not equipped to transport equipment to where we would need it. So there's some little known things about the interstate highway system, but all of the specifications for the highway, as far as how high the bridges are and how strong they are and how wide the roads are, those were all designed with the Defense Department in mind, so they could deploy tanks throughout the country or artillery or whatever was needed back in the day of old-fashioned land wars like World War II. So that's kind of an interesting fact. But obviously the interstate highways also helped business thrive, and that's just because of the transportation link. But you think about the businesses that come about just because the interstate highway system exists. So there's trucking businesses, and of course the automobile and the big three, and all of the goods and services along the road. It's really interesting to me because as someone who studied the National Road in the early 1800s, about every mile or two along the National Road between Maryland and eventually Illinois, there were pubs and there were common houses, and those were like hotel restaurants, and they were every mile or so along the road, and it makes sense because transport was a lot slower then, so a mile was in essence a lot longer as far as a time frame goes than it is today. And a lot of cities, a lot of small towns that are still in place today, grew up along the National Road, and when the interstate highways came through and sort of bypassed the main streets or the downtowns of many of the small cities, those towns died off. And now when you're on the interstate highway, you're generally away from many small towns, and you see the typical plaza where there's a McDonald's and a Holiday Inn Express. Those seem to be the new little centers of commerce. So the point is that whether it's the railroad, the national road, canals, or the interstate highway system, that commerce, business, and population always follows transportation routes. So when we consider history, we need to think about how important that is. Lastly, moving forward, and there's a lot more I'd like to talk about in this chapter, but we just run out of time. Think about this. I know most of you order stuff from Amazon all the time. UPS comes and delivers our Amazon packages, or the U.S. Mail Service. And you also know that Amazon has been experimenting or talking about having drones deliver packages to your door. So, if something like that happens, where all of a sudden the mail service or the UPS man isn't bringing your packages anymore, and drones start to bring your package, that will change commerce as well, and it'll change the industries that people are employed in. It will change everything. So I think it's really important to consider transportation not only as a source of revenue, but also as a source of population and business development, because it really dictates commerce and how we buy things and where we live, and just has a big impact on society in general. The only other thing I need to mention, and there's so much, if I had an hour to lecture I would, but there's so much I'd like to talk to you about. But one of the other interesting things about transportation, and consider the railroad in 1869. So the telegraph was developed in 1848, and the railroad was developed, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. And one of the side effects, as far as business goes and as far as employment goes and social structure goes, is those enterprises, those far-flung enterprises, were really the first types of businesses that had branch offices. So, for us today, it's pretty easy to understand. There's an Apple store in every town, and the headquarters for Apple Retail is in Cupertino, California. And same with gas stations. There's a Speedway station on every corner around here in Ohio, anyway. And the headquarters for Speedway is in Enon, Ohio, down by Dayton, Springfield. And so it's natural for us today to think of businesses in terms of these branch offices. But really, that started with the Transcontinental Railroad and with the telegraph. It was the first time where businesses were spread out and had branch offices, and it really changed the way that we work, and it really started this movement towards the decentralized corporation, where people were working in far-flung branches away from the headquarters. So it really changed the way we're employed. It really changed society, and for many historians, it really began to build this middle management or this middle class in society. So, if you work for Ford, there's Ford plants all over the country, and really this middle class grows out of these branch offices in the beginning of decentralized business. So now, again, decentralization is just something that we take for granted. Most of us work for companies, and many of us don't work at the location where the headquarters is at, and that was really a new thing, and it really changed the way that businesses did accounting. It changed the way that they did hiring. It changed a lot of things, and so it's interesting to think about that as we look at the history of business and technology. As far as the future is concerned, I talked about this idea of perhaps drones delivering packages. If you're familiar with developments in technology now, there are always been different proposals for high-speed trains, for the Hyperloop system, for space travel. So who knows what the future is going to bring. But one thing that you can count on is, as the type of transportation changes, society changes and business changes along with it. So that's all I have for this week. Everyone's doing a great job. Stay safe. Go Rockets. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.